All right, and we can get started here. Distinguished members of the PSI and guests, it is my privilege and honor to welcome you to the February 2025 meeting of the Praed Street Irregulars. My name is Derrick Belanger, as many of you know, and I'm from the class of 2019, and my investiture name is Albert the Dove. This afternoon, we'll start with a brief overview of our activities for the PSI for the last year. And then we'll begin our talk. I'll say a few words about August Derleth's science fiction writing. That'll be followed by Jay Hyde giving a talk on Parker's Dorrington inheritance. And our final presentation will be by Frank Schildiner, aka the Little Hangman, on Harry Dickson, the American Sherlock Holmes. And of course, we'll conclude with the highlight of our annual meeting, the 2025 investitures. So to start us off, I am pleased to welcome Dr. George Vanderberg, which some of us already said hello to, who is the current Lord Warden of the Pontine Marshes and the head of the Praed Street Irregulars. Let's give him a round of virtual applause. All right. George, we're glad that you were able to make it today. So that's great.
I'm glad to be here too.
I'm sure you are. We all hope for a speedy recovery for you.
Yeah.
All right. So now let's get a quick round of Pontine activities since our last meeting, which was February 2024. We were supposed to have an October one, but that ended up getting canceled. So hopefully we can get together again before February next year. So the first thing really to talk about, and I don't know if David Markham, are you on? Because he had said he wanted to say a few words about this. He might not be here though.
I am. Can you hear me? Hello?
Oh, you are. Sorry, David. I didn't see you. So perfect.
Yeah, hi.
Excellent. Okay. So what I thought for today, because I'd have a few people who are involved in certain things, talk about what was going on. And in November, The American Adventures of Solar Pons was released. And Mr. Markham, as always, did a remarkable job assembling a team of writers who wrote excellent new Solar Pons adventures. And since, David, you are here, why don't I'll give you a chance to say a few words about the book.
Okay. Thank you. Since 2017, there have been 8 new Pons volumes that have been published through Belanger Books, and also the 8-volume reissue of the original stories, and also the revived Pontine dossier. Most recently, the most recent set, as Derrick said, is The American Adventures of Solar Pons, published late last year. It contains 12 adventures that cover a nearly 20-year period from 1923 to 1942. And in these stories, Pons and Parker travel to New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Louisiana, Tennessee, Alabama, Wisconsin, and Michigan. It is not so unusual that they would have traveled to America because travel was much easier during Pons' time than it would have been during Holmes's time. And we know from Parker's biography that he lived for a time in the United States and that his first wife, Louisa, was an American. And in Pons' biography, some of his worldwide residences were listed, including New York and Chicago. So I encourage you to read that book. It's got some really great stories from some people who really know stuff about Solar Pons. And I was also going to mention there's a couple more projects in the works for this coming year. First of all, I plan to have this spring my own 3rd collection of new Solar Pons stories finished up within a few months. I just have a few more to write and then to edit it. And then we also want to spread the word that the next Pons anthology will be start of a series along the lines of Rich Ryan's Sherlock Holmes, A Year of Mystery series. If you're not familiar with that, you should be. In that, each volume covers 1 year of Holmes and Watson's careers, beginning in 1881, and then 82 and 83, and so on. So far, there are 8 books up through 1888, and presumably they'll go all the way to Holmes's retirement in 1903. 2 books per year. So we're getting there. Likewise, with Solar Pons, A Year of Mystery, will begin in 1919 when he and Parker met and go through 1939, which is the latest canonical story. I believe Derrick's going to be announcing an official call for submissions for that in the next few days, and that'll have more of the requirements for the stories and what we're looking for, and encourage everybody to participate because each volume will, require a certain number of stories to fill it out to cover all the months and all the years. So I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you.
Thank you, David. This was a great project, and we're really looking forward to starting up that Solar Pons Year of Mystery series. It'll be a lot of fun, and I'll say a little more about it later on here. All right. Another thing was a new issue of the Pontine Dossier Millennium Edition came out in December. And this was issue 5, and it contained essays by David Markham, Brett Fawcett, Chris Chan, Steve Herczig, and me. And actually, Brett Fawcett actually contributed 3 essays to this particular volume. It's available, and we're always looking for submissions. So if you are interested, it's coming out again in December of this year, or even November. We'll see how fast I can edit this year. All right. And of course, we had in New York in January, we had our second PSI dinner, and Luther Norris PSI dinner. And we are planning on making this an annual event on the Thursday of BSI weekend. So the next dinner will be on January 8th, 2026. And Max McGee, who's on with us, was the one who kind of put it together this year. I want to give him credit. And Max, if you want to say a few words about the dinner and the pin you had me put there as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So, as Derrick just mentioned, we have started making this a tradition. I think we missed a year, but we're back. And now, with intention, we will offer what I think is going to be an alternative to the SPOD generally for folks that kind of to recruit them into the Praed Street ecosystem, because I think we've got a lot of what I'd call civilians who were new to the Pontine universe who joined us for oysters. And, aw shucks, we had a great time. Yeah, I think we had about 20 at given times. There were some people that had to leave, some people that arrived. So I'd say we had 17, 18 most of the time. It was a really nice dinner. It is in the Grand Central terminal. Underneath there's the Grand Central Oyster Bar, and generally exorbitant prices for oysters, but it's a fun and beautiful location. The big announcements were that there were, as you probably got in an email, there were exclusive pins for the PSI Oyster Dinner. There were a run of only 17 that Regina Stinson put together for us. And if you weren't there, with very limited exceptions, you couldn't get it. And that was specifically designed to raise funds for a new manuscript series, not associated with the BSI, rather the PSI, because the typewritten, are they typescripts then rather than manuscripts? I'm not sure, but the
Yep.
extant Pontine canon typescripts are all located, or many of them are located at the University of Wisconsin Historical Society, which you can see behind me. And so they were very gracious and willing to give me access to scan in high resolution the typescript, both front and back pages, because some of the most interesting information is on the back of the actual typewritten page, including things like, well, you'll see. But I will be recruiting essayists, people who want to contribute. If you'd like to volunteer to contribute, I'm also going to specifically recruit people who are on this call, some people who are on this call today, with some ideas about topics. The only other thing I have is stay tuned for potentially, if you don't already own a PSI pin featuring the Hound and the PSI smoke, um, George and I are cooking up a little, potentially a new batch. So I will make announcements as soon as that's more formalized, but it will be widely available at cost. So PSI members who are jealous of the ones that exist, it will be a lot less hard to get your hands on.
All right. Thank you very much for that update, Max. All right, the other goings on for this year really were around the Solar Pons Facebook page, which was formed by Ralph Grasso and Wally Condra on July 6, 2022. It's a group for all Solar Pons fans, and we'd love to have you join the group if you're not a member yet. We have, I think, 160-ish members right now. And one thing that's really fun is every I believe first Thursday of the month, Jim MacArthur runs a monthly Solar Ponds discussion group on one of the Solar Pond stories, and the group chat. Unfortunately, I usually can't make it, but I can read the chat afterwards, and it's fascinating hearing what people have to say about the stories. So if you are interested, definitely, and also definitely join the group, because we were probably Ralph and I actually are working on probably a Facebook event on that page later this year. And so I'll have more information to you as we kind of decide what exactly it's going to look like. But I'll get that out to everybody when we do. So that's coming up later this year. All right. And so you already heard about some of these, but there are a few upcoming Solar Ponds projects and events. We are still working on putting together a collection of the original Solar Ponds comics by Derleth and Frank Uppetal. And most likely I'm thinking it's still probably going to be at least a year away just because of some other things that we're working on, but that's coming up. David mentioned the Solar Pons Your Mystery Story collection. Max mentioned the Black Narcissus Facsimile edition. We'll still have the monthly Solar Pons Facebook meetings, that Facebook event, and then issue 6 of the Pontine dossier. So we've got quite a few fun events coming up. And then, of course, we'll have our dinner again in New York in January. So lots of opportunities. And if anybody's like, I can never make it to New York, but I'd love to host my own Solar Ponds dinner, we would love to hear about that. That would be a fun thing to do. And there's no reason why you couldn't. So just something to keep in mind. All right. So next up is the talks for today. And I get the odd chore of introducing myself. So I've got the first talk of the day. And so my talk is titled From Solar Ponds to Tex Harrigan. Sorry, I always want to say Harrison, but it's Harrigan. Derleth's Sci-Fi Detective Stories. So for those who don't know me, and I'm guessing everybody on this call does, I'm the co-owner of Belanger Books, which published the first ebooks of editions of the Solar Ponds stories. We were able to put out new editions of the original Derleth texts, and we were able to actually last year work with a company, Hatchet, and get editions published in India for the first time ever. So that was really cool. I've been published outside of like Solar Ponds in the Baker Street Journal, Canadian Holmes, the Sherlock Holmes Journal, the Strand Magazine, and I had a story in the Mysterious Bookshop Presents the Best Mysteries of the Year back in 2023. So I do keep busy, and but I'm very excited to be involved with the Solar Ponds Society, and I love Derleth's work. And so let's talk about some of his lesser known work. So this book is called Harrigan's File. And in 1975, 4 years after Derleth's death, Arkham House released a 236-page collection of his stories, of the Harrigan's File stories. They feature reporter Tex Harrigan, and in all of his stories, he tells an unnamed narrator about these quote-unquote, he calls them queer people. He'd collected over the years of his career these stories about these unusual people. And what makes this story in my collections really stand out from Derleth's other work is that, as is explained in the interior jacket, this collection, quote, contains all the science fiction August Derleth ever wrote and prepared for publication. Now, while it's true that this collection of stories is his only kind of just straight science fiction, we know that throughout his entire career, Derleth wrote quite a bit of science fiction. Some involved the Cthulhu mythos, and of course, there's a few that involve the Sherlock Holmes of Praed Street, Solar Pons. And what I found when I looked at these stories, and even one or two of the Solar Pons stories, is I think they really stand out as early examples of the science fiction detective stories popularized in later years in TV shows like Kolchak, the Night Stalker, and the X-Files. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today, is kind of this science fiction of Derleth and how it kind of evolved, and maybe even influenced some of these very famous science fiction shows. Although I did not find any evidence of that, they're at least very similar in style. So let's talk about the early days. So Derleth's first foray into science fiction was in 1931 when he co-wrote the story The Horror from the Depths with Mark Shore. This story is also what we'd consider the beginning of the Derleth mythos. It's a restructuring of the work of H.P. Lovecraft, in which the good alien race of elder gods fights against the evil great old ones. Both sets of creatures are from beyond the outer reaches of space and are battling for control of the earth. The story, which was originally titled The Horror from the Lake, follows a team of engineers, anthropologists, and our professor, who's kind of our science fiction detective, who happens to aptly be named Holmes. No surprise there. And Holmes recovers a strange spongy fossil from Lake Michigan. And the fossil ends up being a living creature, which summons more alien monsters from the bottom of the lake. And there's a big rampage, leaving a lot of people dead or completely insane, as often happens in Lovecraftian literature. But the professor, Jordan Holmes, acts as the detective, and he's trying to determine if there's a scientific explanation for the strange amoeboid creature that has been unearthed and is kind of attacking everybody. And he admits, he says, quote, "This thing's beyond our knowledge. It's perhaps older than the beginning of our knowledge." And then he goes to ancient texts. Of course, he goes to the Necronomicon to fight the creatures. And one thing he does is he discovers in the Necronomicon a consecutive and logical story of the age-long struggle between the forces of cosmic evil and the elder gods. So what I pointed out is just that it's not some story of magic. He's talking about there's a logical sequence that this ties in, and that he is using science as he's kind of fighting the monsters here. And while it, leans much more heavily into horror, it does definitely have some science fiction tropes in it. We've got the alien invaders, and we even get an early use of a space death ray. So that's right out of science fiction. There is, of course, that detective character in the form of Holmes using research and logic to fight the creature. So this is like a very early science fiction detective. And Derleth's other Cthulhu stories, such as The Lurker at the Threshold, which is supposedly co-written by Lovecraft, but really it's more Derleth than anything else, and The Trail of Cthulhu. Derleth did not stop at blending science fiction into horror stories. He used it a lot, and then he also started blending into his mystery stories, as we see in this very lovely cover here, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And this particular issue had The Adventure of the Snitch in Time, a Solar Pons science fiction story. And if you have not read it, it's kind of a funny story. It's a parody. Okay, the story is told with tongue firmly in cheek. And it tells of Agent Tobias Athelney of the Terra Bureau of Investigation, who's traveled back in time 700 years to consult Solar Pons about Moriarty, the leader of the criminal club Cerise, who travels through the multiverse stealing works of art. Agent Athelney tells Pons, "In this multitude of alternative universes, Mr. Pons, there are some in which you and Parker are fictitious characters." So that was kind of fun. It's a really fun story. And in this story, Pons is fascinated by the visitor from another world. Well, Parker's dismissive. But Agent Athelney tells Pons and Parker about the future, where he comes from, where the work of Walt Kelly, the Pogo cartoons, are considered as great as the work of like Leonardo da Vinci. It's kind of funny. And the agent asks Pons for advice on how to catch Moriarty. And we have one of our early crossovers here because Pons pretty much recommends Perry Mason to go after Moriarty in it. It's a really fun story, and if you haven't read it, you can get all of the Derleth Solar Pons sci-fi stories in either the Apocrypha of Solar Pons or in the original Solar Pons omnibus edition. So either of these has all of the stories. There are 6 stories in total, and one of them in particular, or The Adventure of the Ball of Nostradamus, features Pons solving a series of child murders. And minus the niche in time, all the other sci-fi stories in the books are straightforward. Okay. One involves a vampire, but again, there's kind of a scientific explanation for it. In the Adventure of the Ball of Nostradamus, though, Pons finds the murderer of these children, and it ends up that the person named Abraham Wedigan is explaining, he's like, well, I'm killing these kids because they are going to grow up and kind of be the next Hitlers. Like, they're going to be these horrible, horrible dictators. And in the end, Pons stops Wedigan from murdering his final target. He gets all the other ones. But in the end, Pons is like, I don't know if I should have stopped them because he could be telling the truth. And there's kind of this unknown aspect of things with it. And that whole kind of the audience maybe figuring out more than Pons is really kind of that first thing of like the audience maybe knowing more than the detective, which is kind of common in these science fiction detective stories. So now we come to Derleth's pure science fiction stories. And I got to say, I absolutely love these stories. These are a lot of fun. The Tex Harrigan stories are really great. So Derleth wrote these from 1951 to 1965, and they star ace reporter Tex Harrigan. And in these ones, there's no humor really. I mean, there's some that are kind of silly, but there's no straightforward like laugh out loud humor. There's no monsters from beyond usually, and there's seemingly no detectives. But structurally, the Tex Harrigan stories are organized a lot like mystery stories. But in this case, the audience gets to uncover the truth while he's kind of still left a little bit in the dark. He's always just a little bit in the dark. So Derleth only composed 17 of these stories, but the formula is pretty much Harrigan tells the narrator who he's meeting with a strange science fiction tale about a person who either mysteriously died, disappeared, or claimed to have invented some miraculous device, but then that character, but then he's discredited. And then in between these first-person narrative parts of the story, there's these third-person parts where the readers learn the truth. So these little in-between parts where you're finding out what's actually going on, and that's where the reader kind of learns the truth. So this particular story, A Corner for Lucia, is a great one. It was published in Weird Tales. And in this one, this is a good example. Harrigan tells the story of Lucia Kent. She's a 19-year-old girl who accidentally steps into another dimension. So Harrigan says that a little girl told him that she saw Lucia Kent simply walking out of sight into space. First her right leg, then part of her swinging left arm, and then her full body. The narrator admits to Harrigan that this sounds fantastic, but then adds, children have extremely vivid imaginations. Through the third-person parts of the story, that's where we learn Miss Kent's story, that she'd walked into this other world where she met Tom, this like man of her dreams. And he lived in this house that she'd always imagined. It's like the perfect house to settle down in. And throughout it, where it's unveiled that Tom is actually this creature shaped something like, quote, an open clamshell with tentacles feathering out from both sides and weaving in the air. but Lucia only sees like Tom, so she doesn't care that he's really this like weird monster. So in the end, Lucia Kent and her lover disappear from the world and are never seen again. And Harrigan says he hopes she and Tom end up living in her dream house, wherever that may be. He admits, though, it's hard enough to figure, quote, he has a hard enough time figuring out how normal people act, but the queer ones never give you a real lead to anything. And that's how all these stories go. Harrigan always comes close to discovering like the truth, but in the end, he has to admit that there's no proof of anything out of the ordinary. And it kind of feels like the ending of an episode of the X-Files, where, you know, Mulder's like, I know that this has got to be aliens, but I have no real evidence. But then we always see the little extra scene at the end with the alien or the monster or whatever. So this could easily say the truth is out there. So again, potential influence here. Now, not everyone is a fan like me of the Tex Harrigan tales. In fact, a lot of the critics did not like them, thought they were too formulaic. In my opinion, though, I think I don't know. It's the genre is kind of formulaic by its nature, and other highly successful science fiction series, like the X-Files in particular, and some episodes of Kolchak, kind of follow this pattern as well. And again, no matter how much Fox Mulder tries, to prove that the government's secretly working with aliens, he always comes up short. And that's kind of similar to these. So, like I said, the series, in a sense, some of the structure to me is so similar. I do wonder if Chris Carter ever actually read the Tex Harrigan stories, but I've not found any evidence of it. All right, so now here's my big question. So throughout his career, Derleth dabbled in science fiction, and he started combining it with horror writings inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, mixed in Solar Pons, and then comes Tex Harrigan, and unfortunately, the Harrigan's file has never been printed beyond the initial run of 4,000 hardcover books. You can get it. It's easy to get a copy, but that's it. There's only 4,000 out there. So, this would be one I would love eventually to do a new edition of. I also think it'd be cool. Again, my big question is, wouldn't this be a great anthology TV show? It would fit really well. There's been new editions of The Twilight Zone. I don't know, make note, Hollywood, because this could be your next X-Files, and then get Derleth again some more credit. All right, so that's my talk on Rex Harrigan and Derleth science fiction stories. Does anyone have I got a few minutes if anyone has any questions. Brett's got a question.
Hi, Derek. So thanks so much. This was great. I loved reading your article, and I loved going over it again with you. And I've read.
I lost you there, Brett.
I'm sorry?
You're breaking up. Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Oh, lower hand.
Are you still there, Brett?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Okay, great. So I got a comment that I think you'll appreciate, and I have a question for you.
Sure.
So I think I might have some evidence of indirect influence of August Derleth on X-Files. It's very, very, this is tenuous. This is, this is the kind of clue that Parker would dismiss. But so we know that X-Files was influenced by Twin Peaks.
Right.
And Twin Peaks, was co-created by Mark Frost. And
right.
Mark Frost plays a role in Twin Peaks. He's a journalist named Cyril Pons.
Yeah, his dad. His dad. Yes, Mark Jones's dad. Yes.
Yes, yes. And so he has confirmed in podcasts that Cyril Pons' character is named after Solar Pons. So
right.
So there may have been, and Twin Peaks has a kind of regional American literature feel to me a little bit. So I don't know if anyone was reading the Harrigan stuff per se, but there's some evidence of Derleth influence on Twin Peaks, and then maybe by way of that, there's X-Files. So if anyone can find any more on that, go nuts, please. But I wanted to ask, when you're talking about science fiction and all this, I guess, do you think Derleth really believes in genres? Because, and this was my first article for the Pontian dossier was kind of about this. But you know, the Cthulhu stuff and Solar Pons, they're all in the same universe. You know, Pons pulls a whole bunch of other pulp detectives into his universe, and even like the regional fiction. You know, his Derleth's serious fiction. You know, he wrote detective stories that were set in Sac Prairie, Wisconsin, right? The Judge Peck stories that Dr. Chan talked about before.
Right.
And he even mentions H.P. Lovecraft in one of those books, and he mentions Sac Prairie in one of the mythos stories. I think it's Whisperer in Darkness. So, and even the Harrigan. So that story you mentioned, right? Corner for Lucia. First of all, that monster sounds like something out of the Cthulhu mythos.
Yeah.
And they mention in there, they do mention that they hired a private detective named Blake and his assistants to investigate. And I'm like, is that Sexton Blake? I wonder. So really, does Derleth even kind of believe in genre, or does he just kind of have this one big cosmos or mythos where anything he's interested in can kind of happily coexist?
You know, I mean, my thought is I think Derleth is having a blast. I mean, I think he likes bringing in all these other characters from other series, because we have everything from the Saint comes in to one of the stories. Karnacki, the Ghost Finders mentioned in one. The Lovecraft's mentioned, but he mentioned the Necronomicon's a fake book. Pons does. So I mean, it's kind of interesting. I think Derleth likes playing around and having fun with it. And I know in the latest issue of the Pontine dossier, Chris Chan has an article about a character. Now I can't remember his name, but it's a character who is on a lot of different TV shows. He was on the X-Files, but he was also on, like, I think, Chicago Hope and was mentioned in other mysteries too. This, like, one character that's in a lot of different TV shows played by the same actor. So I think it's a fun thing to kind of play around with. I don't know if it would say anything about Derleth not believing in genres. I think he kind of embraces them and has fun with them, to be honest with you. Any other question? In fact, and let me actually stop now. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Just so I could see if anybody has one. And I believe our next, oh, there we go, Ray. John Munch. That's right. That was the name of that character. Okay. So our next speaker is Jay Hyde. How you doing, Jay? Yeah, you can unmute, yeah. And his talk is titled Treasure and Tribulation, Thoughts on Parker's Dorrington Inheritance. Jay remembers being intrigued by the cover of one of the pinnacle book collections of Pons adventures he spotted in a New Hampshire store during a family vacation in the 1970s. He was already a fan of Sherlock Holmes by then, but didn't have the opportunity to read and enjoy the work of Derleth and Copper until many years later. Jay authored an article titled What Do You Make of It, Parker? In the Pontine Dossier Millennium Edition. And he's a member of the Six Napoleons of Baltimore and the Red Circle of Washington, D.C. And he's been published in the Baker Street Journal on 2 occasions. And Jay, you're going to kind of give a talk without a slideshow, correct?
Sadly, I have no slides for this.
No, there's nothing wrong with that. It's good to get a break sometimes. All right. And I'm going to just go into speaker view. And you are on, my friend.
All right. Thank you, Derrick. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Nice to see my hero, Peter Blau, is among you. Peter, the esteemed leader of the Red Circle. The name of my talk is Treasure and Tribulation, some thoughts on Parker's Dorrington Inheritance. And I'll preface it with a quote from that adventure from Pons. Where there is treasure, Parker, there is also likely to be tribulation. It has been said that every piece of jewelry tells a story. Gems and precious metals are central to several of Solar Pons' adventures. In fact, they feature in more than a dozen investigations, were nearly 1 in 5 of the stories that were penned by August Derleth. It all began with Pons' observation that Dr. Parker's scarab pin suggests Egypt, which may have been something he acquired while a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps in the land of the Pharaohs, and or evidence of England's pervasive Egyptomania. That deductive-driven introduction would lead to joint tenancy of 7B Praed Street and a partnership that would see the two men solve crimes involving such fascinating names as the Eye of Siva and the Orloff diamond. But nowhere is the linkage of treasure and tribulation more pronounced, or for Parker, more personal, than in the adventure of the Dorrington inheritance. It was what the doctor described as, quote, a singular matter, which was to have a more profound and lasting effect on me than Pons. You'll recall the tale begins with a letter to Pons from Constance Dorrington, followed by her visit to Praed Street to explain that she fears her father's life will be forfeit to the scoundrels who are hounding him unless he takes steps to protect himself. We learn that Constance's father, Amos, is the only son of Alexander Dorrington, who discovered and was a long-time owner of the premier diamond mine in Kimberley, South Africa, and also owned the Maricot diamond. He left Constance's father a considerable inheritance. Parker is smitten. His narrative describes Constance as a surprisingly beautiful young woman. Introducing her to the doctor, Pons says, "I see by that look of soft and yielding awe, Parker would like even more to be of service to you." And the remark brings a touch of color to the cheeks of both Parker and Constance. Now here, let me say a word or two about diamonds themselves. It has been suggested that the name was a nod to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's novel, The Maricot Deep. Pons explains that, quoting here, "The Maricot takes rank with the Kohinoor and Hope diamonds for size and value, which would make it a very, very significant diamond indeed. The Hope, which is famed for its size of 45 carats, was extracted in India in the 17th century, and it's now on permanent exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. In fact, I'm wondering if Derrick had an opportunity to see it during his recent journey to our nation's capital. The Hope's estimated value is between $200 and $350 million. Now, although twice as large, the 105 carat Kohinoor may not be as well known as the Hope outside the United Kingdom. It too was found in India, and it's been the focus of long-time diplomatic controversy over how it came to be in the possession of the British royalty. It's valued at up to $400 million and is on display in the Jewel House at the Tower of London. Why are diamonds so valuable? Well, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger once quipped that a diamond is merely a chunk of coal that did well under pressure. In truth, diamonds have fascinated humans for thousands of years. The stone's name is derived from the Greek word adamas, which translates to unconquerable. In ancient times, the jewels were believed to have magical properties and were incorporated into amulets, jewelry, or talismans. In the Middle Ages, diamonds and other precious jewels became symbols of power and wealth, and were often set in crowns and swords. Of course, in modern times, diamonds have become representations of love and commitment. Now, there are two significant events that would have contributed to the value of the Maricot and other notable stones. The first is early scarcity. In the 1800s, diamonds were rare, with limited production, and that scarcity drove their value. Then came the South African boom, from which the Dorringtons, among others, prospered. Discovery of the Kimberley mine in 1870 marked the beginning of large-scale diamond mining, and the discovery of diamonds there revolutionized the market. Cecil Rhodes, a well-known name, founded De Beers in 1888, and eventually controlling 90% of the world's rough diamond production and solidifying their dominance among gemstones. Kimberley, where Dorrington's premier mine was located, is known as the Diamond City. Today, its main attraction is what is known as the Big Hole. Imagine a hand-dug hole the size of 8 football fields and 700 feet deep, and you have some idea of the labor that went into creating it. In 1872, 1 year after digging started, the population of the camp of diggers grew to around 50,000. In 1914, before it closed, about 14.5 million carats, roughly 6,000 pounds of diamonds were mined in the Big Hole. At the time of Dorrington's mining operation, there were as many as 5 big holes in Kimberley. And with the exception of the Big Hole, they have mostly been filled in. In their initial meeting in early 1928, Constance Dorrington explains to Pons and Parker that she fears her grandfather cheated his 2 partners in their diamond mining operation. Quote, "I've begun to believe that father's inheritance includes something more sinister than pecuniary rewards of diamond mining," she tells them. It seems Amos has been the target of 3 written warnings, but when Constance suggested he consider making restitution to the families of the 2 men, one of whom is still alive at the time of the adventure, he wouldn't hear of it. Investigating the threats, Pons visits the Dorrington home and learns of an attempt to push Amos Dorrington into the path of an oncoming car that has left him in grave condition. Suspecting that there will be another attempt on Amos's life, Pons sets a trap. Concealed in Amos Dorrington's room, Pons and Parker watch and wait. When a dark figure enters the room, Pons strikes him with a leaded stick. Constance is then summoned. "My dear lady," says Pons, "if you could free your father from the danger which hangs over him with but 1 diamond, would you do it?" "Indeed I would," Constance tells Pons. Touching the diamond engagement ring on her finger, Pons says, "This is the stone, Miss Dorrington. Return it." Moments later, Constance is horrified to discover that her fiancé, Count Carlo de Sepulveda, was behind the murderous scheme. "There would seem to have been some slight misunderstanding in this little problem, Miss Dorrington," Pons goes on to explain. "It was by design, but no one coming to your difficulty with an open mind could fail to be aware of it. There was only 1 diamond that was important, and that was the stone on Miss Dorrington's finger. The counterfeit count was after her inheritance." After Sepulveda is collared by the police, Pons suggests that Parker visit Constance to offer comfort. The 2 would marry 5 years later. A long engagement, perhaps, but as Bob Byrne points out in his case notes on solarpons.com, Constance, quoting here, receives an emotional shock from the revelations regarding her fiancé, and she was wealthy, likely causing Dr. Parker to move slowly in his courtship. In any event, Parker married particularly well the second time around. An only child, Constance's wealth would have provided the financial flexibility for the doctor to rely less on his medical practice, even if domestic bliss meant he would have less time to accompany Pons and provide written accounts of the adventures. Which brings us to one last essential question. What became of the Maricot diamond? Parker's account of the adventure is silent on that matter, aside from an early reference that it was owned, past tense, by Constance's grandfather. As mentioned before, Count Sepulveda may have hoped, but not necessarily known, if it was still in a family's possession. And Pons, you will recall, was unable to interview the bedridden Amos prior to the case's conclusion. And as for Constance, she made no mention of the diamond whatsoever. We must assume, however, that Parker would have been certain to learn of the Maricot's whereabouts at some point in his lengthy courtship. Was it inherited by Amos Dorrington? And if so, did it eventually become a possession of Parker's spouse? Or did the family either donate it to a museum or choose to sell it to a private collector? We may never know. What we do know is that from his modest beginnings as the wearer of a simple scarab pin, Dr. Parker was destined to join a family whose fortune was built on the mining of sparkling gemstones that have been a valuable commodity since 300 BC, continue to have a rich cultural significance, and will no doubt dazzle us for many years to come.
All right. Thank you, Jay. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Jay? Gallery for a second. I guess I do have one question. Just have you ever did Derleth ever mention anything about what he thought of Maricot Deep? Because a lot of people don't particularly like that Doyle story.
I was unable to find any reference to that in the time I was researching it.
I was just curious. It's an interesting.
It is regarded as one of the lesser adventures.
Yeah.
So and I am wondering, did you see the Hope Diamond when you were in DC?
I did not. I did. I was at a conference, so I only had a little tiny bit of time to explore. But yeah, definitely a city I would like to go back to explore all the different Smithsonians and museums and everything there. So thank you for asking, but I did not get a chance. All right. Thank you again, Jay. And our final speaker of the afternoon is right there, Mr. Frank Schildiner. Hey, brother. So, hold on. I was on the wrong spot. Okay. Frank's talk is titled Harry Dickson, an American Sherlock, or The American Sherlock Holmes. Frank is a martial arts instructor at Amorisi's Mixed Martial Arts in New Jersey. He is the writer of the novels Caesar Now Be Still, Napoleon's Vampire Hunters, The Last Days of Atlantis, Secrets of the Nine, and his work has appeared in 2 volumes of the MX book of New Sherlock Holmes stories, as well as several short stories and articles he's published on various subjects. He resides in New Jersey with 2 cats who are indifferent to his work. But fortunately for Frank, we are not indifferent to his work, and we look forward to his talk. So Frank, I'm just going to share the PowerPoint you sent, and then you can get started, okay?
You may be hearing sick cats in the background. My apologies if you do. They're determined.
Cats usually are.
Yes, they are. So the reason I brought this as an idea for us is we are interested and devoted to the works of Holmes, Holmesian pastiche, if you want to call it, Solar Pons, homages. And one that's pretty lesser known is that of Harry Dickson, the American Sherlock Holmes. I'm going to show you a little bit about it, but I will preface this that there is no cross-pollination between this and Derleth's work. However, you will probably see as you go some parallels to Jean Ray and his work to August Derleth as I presented. So it really starts with Jean Ray, real name Raymondus Johannes de Kramer, a Belgian writer who started in 1887, 1964, and he adapted the concept of Harry Dickson for 10 years. Next slide. It was originally derived from the series. I am not saying that German name because I will destroy it, but it translates to The Secret Files of the King of Detectives, starring Sherlock Holmes and his new sidekick, Harry Taxon. This is because at that period, there was very little paying attention to copyright. Germans, Spanish, Italians, and especially Russians wrote their own Sherlock Holmes stories, and it was hard to get it all the way over to the UK, and later when they did, they would crush it downward. So moving forward. Next slide. It was relaunched by the Dutch-Flemish publisher Roman Book, and I'm not saying that word either, as a reprint of the series, but they changed the name to Harry Dickson, the American Sherlock Holmes. Harry Dickson, the American Sherlock Holmes, and there's the Flemish version of it lasted 180 issues. The origin of the name Harry Dickson is a much speculated one in Europe, especially by one of my publishers, Jean-Marc L'Officier of Black Coat Press. Before the appearance of Harry Dickson, there was a small series of stories in France about Alan Dickson, King of the Detectives, by the same creator of Dr. Omega, who, if you want to find some really interesting stuff, Dr. Omega is very much like Doctor Who, the original, as in William Hartnell. He's described the same way, he's drawn the same way, and he does a whole adventure in space with a male companion and a second male companion who is a engineer named Fred. It is a very unique idea, and many people have speculated that they may have gotten ideas for Doctor Who from there. I have never seen one drop of evidence, but most people want to write it. So it goes that way. You'll find some great stories based on it. So Harry Dickson replaced it, and it was pretty much just a change of name and they took Harry and Dickson and shoved it together. His assistant was a character named Tom Johnson. Next slide, please. So Jean Ray took over in 1928, but somewhere shortly, and we don't know where because it was very unusually done, he asked the publisher to change the stories. The reason being, he found it completely boring to just rewrite it. He then created new stories involving monsters, vampires, and unusual characters with Scooby-Doo endings, as in you rip off the mask and it's always not really there. Particular favorites are some of the ones above, and they have all been translated into English by Black Coat Press. I have all of those. They're great. First one I actually read was the first one, The Vampire with the Yellow Eyes, also known as The Heir of Dracula. Moving on, next slide. Here are some of the unique villains that Harry Dickson faced, and in every case, these are not monsters in any way, but are unusual people. Guru, I guess that's the pronunciation, an Aztec god who lived in the hidden temple of iron beneath London. There's a lot of hidden temples beneath London, that's real fascinating into it. Could be a whole article just on the many structures that are under there that nobody seems to know got built. Another one, Hanuman, who didn't exist, an evil Hindu god. Professor Flax, the human monster, really cool character there. Urali, I never pronounced that right. Ellis, who is supposed to be a Gorgon in modern. There it is, the vampire with red eyes, which is what they changed it to. It was originally written as U, which is yellow. Georgette Cuvier, aka the Spider, who is the daughter of Professor Flax and an ongoing love interest of Harry Dickson himself. And you can see what Harry Dickson looks like there. It's a very good example. And Mysterious, the Master of Illusions. That is a very typical visual. Yep, Ray, I'm going to talk about that shortly. Mysterious and that visual there, that's from one of the covers from Black Coat Press. That's very much what he was drawn to look like. They just did a little bit more of a modern, and yes, always with a scientific explanation. Next slide, please. Harry Dickson comics, just like Ray just was mentioning. I have one of them right here, the first one, which is Mysterious. There's another one coming in May. You can find it on Amazon. That's where I found it. These are very popular in France, and they do have started to give Jean Ray credit for most of the work. He wrote a lot of stories between 1928 and 1938, and as I've been told by Jean-Marc L'Officier, he's French himself. Around 1938 is when most fiction stopped in France. I think we all understand why. Didn't really resume until 1950s. Though there was one series, I'll mention it and even show a copy. This is the Nyctalope. The Nyctalope did exist at that time. However, that was not a good thing because the writer, Delahere, was a collaborator. So after the war, he stopped being a writer, if you will. He wrote some stories afterwards, but he was in prison at the time. Next slide, please. Jean Ray's post Harry Dickson works. This is another parallel I found to uh, August Derleth, is where he's better known for his horror work, including this movie, which I blew Brian's mind over in January. Here's a copy of it, my copy of it, Malpertius, starring, yes, that's Orson Welles. And look at the cast if you see, quite a good cast that they had there. Jean-Pierre Cassel is a favorite of mine. Susan Hampshire, quite good. And it is one of the first times I ever found a director's cut, because the first cut that they sent out, they chopped it down and it was apparently very confusing. So the director, Harry Kummel, he took those extra 20 minutes and put them back in and re-released it. And it's considered a preferred version of said movie. He wrote other short stories and articles, mostly on the subject of horror, until 1964. He was very published and regarded by the French public, especially, as more of a horror writer. Next slide, please. Here are the modern version of it. Black Coat Press, as well as Cine East Comic with that. You can see a few versions of that. They were all very enjoyable. Every one of these is not a full novel. They are short stories or novellas that are put together. Most are translated by the late Brian Stableford, who was an amazing British science fiction writer. He did a lot of work with Black Coat Press. I have the whole collection that we have here and a few more. And next slide. Another final return, thank you, but this is my return with Harry Dickson. I wrote him in a story for that particular book. Harry Dickson takes place originally in the pre-World War I period, and when this came out, I had the opportunity to write him. I had to do a rewrite because David was very clear that Harry Dickson would not have owned 221B Baker Street, and I'm the person who doesn't care about that stuff, so I just rewrote it and put him somewhere else. I don't remember where. The comics are in French. For the answer to the question, this copy that I showed you is in English, even though I have been studying French since the beginning of COVID. For the fact that I like so much French fiction, I'm still not comfortable enough to own it. And when I do, I will contact John Mark because he has Hexagon Comics and they have a lot of great comic books under there. Some of my favorites, actually. So this is what I just wanted to give you guys, ladies and gentlemen, a introduction to a pastiche that ran at basically the same times as Solar Pons, a little before, but is basically not known until the latter days because it was never really put out there. They did want to make a Harry Dickson movie in the 60s, but they never got to it. And well, considering they were making them very campy back then, such as my Phantomas copies, might as well just show this. Here he is. There's Phantomas from the 1960s. Had it made by a friend of mine. The 60s version was very tongue-in-cheek with Jean Maras, but I love it. It doesn't matter to me. It's very funny. So thank you for my presentation. And if they have any questions, please ask. I'm happy to help. Thank you.
Yay. All right. Does anyone have any questions for Frank? Oh, Brett does. Go ahead, Brett.
Okay, can you hear me again? I seem to be
I can
having
hear you,
trouble.
Brett.
Okay,
We're good. We're
fabulous.
good on you today, right now.
All
Yeah.
right, okay, we managed something. Thanks so much. That this was really interesting. You're whetting my appetite to check some of this out. But I just wondered if you had any reflections. This actually kind of goes back to Derrick's presentation, because you get Harry Dickson, who lives at 221B. You also have, like I mentioned before, Sexton Blake, supposedly lives at 221B. And you got Solar Pons, he doesn't. But all three of those guys are in the vein of Sherlock Holmes, but they're a little more in the James Bond, even the sci-fi realm, right? And I just wondered if you had any kind of observations about that, or any reflections on why is it that afterwards you had. I mean, obviously Derleth doesn't do that a lot, but he's willing to do that. But these other guys, they were a little more whole hog into that, and I do know that Sexton Blake influenced Sidney Newman. So there may have been a bit of Doctor Who influence there, right? Like Adam Adams was supposed to be Sexton Blake at first and this kind of thing. So I don't know. I wondered if you have any reflections on that, on how you have all these successors to Sherlock Holmes, where the authors are willing to go a little more, a little crazier in the sci-fi territory or realm.
I did. I was thinking about that a great deal when I started discussing this as a possibility with Derrick. My thought is, see, the rule of thumb for the Harry Dickson stories when Jean Ray took over, the only rule that the publishers made was he could write anything he wants, but he has to use the German covers. He could not replace the covers, no extra expenses. Jean Ray had a preference for horror, theatrics, Grand Green, that kind of story. He went to his strength, which is more of a horror, sci-fi, um, not quite gothic, but more modern gothic, if you will, version. It's the parallel I also make is my own writing. I've written several stories, mysteries, etc., and you will always find a preference for fighting in mine. Why? Martial arts instructor, crazy on the subject. I think in the case of Harry Dickson, it was because of the horror aspects, because that's what the writer preferred. For Sexton Blake, who I have been reading a great deal of lately, especially some of his more unique villains, such as Monsieur Zenith, it's because the writer preferred a more espionage laced tale. And also later on, as Sexton Blake went on, this is something I learned from Mark Hodder's work rather than my own observation. They started changing with the time. He started he became very much a Sherlock Holmes pastiche. He slowly started morphing into closer to something like a John Creasy version of the stories, like the Toff. And then he went totally to whatever the current concept was. I have several of the 1950s and 60s Sexton Blake stories, and they're very much in the period of what was preferred. And if you compare them to the original days of, say, the first appearance of Monsieur Zenith or the Congress of Criminals or Miss Death or any of the others, it's like totally different characters. As to why they could do this over the course of time, I have had some friends who said there were two Sexton Blakes, but I one of those situations where I'm just going to go with Sherlock Holmes is immortal and he can be written anywhere. Same with Harry Dickson, and I think people overthink that part of it. That's just an opinion, obviously. So I hope that answered your question, Brett. I like to give all, and if anybody else, jump in.
All right. Thank you, Frank
You're
and
welcome.
Jay, for your wonderful talks. But now we got to move on to the moment we've all been waiting for, um, which is the investitures of the year. So I am proud to act as equerry for the Lord Warden and announce this year's class of the Praed Street Irregulars. So here comes our PSI class. Just give me one sec again. Keep switching around here. All right. Okay, here we go. So, all right. Our first investiture of the afternoon is Larry Feldman. So, like Ebenezer Snawley in The Adventure of the Unique Dickensians, Larry is a bibliophile and he's got a wonderful collection of like the shadow books of Sherlock Holmes. Of course, you can't have Sherlock Holmes without Solar Pons. And Larry has been a very active member in the Solar Pons Facebook group, particularly in the monthly meetings. He's always making the discussions rich and adding insights and making all the conversations fascinating. So, Larry, with you being a bibliophile, we felt a little case filled with books would be an appropriate investiture name for you. So, congratulations to Larry. Our next investiture is going to be no surprise, is Jay Hyde, who gave that lovely talk this afternoon. So, as we heard from his wonderful talk this afternoon, Jay is a Ponzian scholar who's had several pieces, mainly focusing on Dr. Parker. And one quote I loved in his essay, What Do You Make of It, Parker, which is in the 4th issue of the Pontine dossier, Jay argues that Dr. Parker was both a valued and a necessary asset to Solar Pons. And Jay, I got to say, you as a scholar are a necessary and vital asset to Solar Pons community. And so after your talk today, I am proud to bestow upon you the title of the Dorrington Inheritance. So congratulations, sir.
Thank you.
Our next investiture is a big fan of Sherlock Holmes and Edwardian and Victorian, the eras of the Edwardian Victoria, and more recently, Solar Pons. Hillary Waters attended the Luther Norris Solar Pons dinner in New York in January and has been hooked since in Pons. And one of the most precious memories I had from the dinner actually happened before the dinner. When we were walking to the oyster bar, we saw the Algonquin, and Hillary told us how she and her husband had been there. He's a playwright, and when they were newlyweds. And so we had to go in, and we did, and it was a very special moment. And so, Hillary, I could not think of a better investiture title for you than this quote from Solar Pond's story. You are a most devoted wife. So congratulations to you for that title.
Thank you so much. That's lovely. Thank you so much.
Our next investiture could not be here today, but I told him I was going to make it happen anyway. His name is Ralph Grasso, and I believe we all know him because he started the Solar Pons Facebook group. And Ralph has helped grow the Solar Pons community through his Solar Pons fans page on Facebook. I got to interview Ralph over email for the second issue of the Pontine dossier, and he said, like, while the Facebook sites for our Solar Pons fans, his real objective was to introduce new readers to Solar Pons and get people more involved in the Solar Pons community, reading the canon, and just having a great time with all of us. And so, Ralph, I know you're going to watch the video of this, and for steering more people to the Solar Pons canon, we bestow you the investiture of Captain Hyatt Norton. So you're the captain of our ship, Ralph. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, our next investiture is another bibliophile, and this is George Sheets. And George has been a librarian, if you know George, for I think it's over 40 years he's been involved in libraries. And as we know, one of the aspects of Solar Pond stories, as we've talked about quite a bit today, is that way that they bring in other characters from literature, particularly pulp fiction. So we've got I can't, librarians, of course, love that stuff. So we've got Sherlock Holmes in the stories because this is illustrious predecessor. We've got Fu Manchu, as we all know, for the Doctor. We got the Saint, as we mentioned, Perry Mason. But in the Adventure of the Haunted Library, Pons works with a character we felt would be an appropriate title for you, George. So you get Carnacki's title. George, you are the Ghost Finder.
Oh, I love it. Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored.
You're very welcome. And I have to say that our Lord Warden was definitely behind that title too. So
Well, from one George to another, thank you.
from one George to another. All right, and our final investiture for the class of 2025 goes to Pamela Jean, aka PJ Sullivan. And PJ is an extremely talented artist who actually turned the steps of her staircase in her house into books, like they're giant book titles, and it's incredible. And she did an amazing recreation of 221B Baker Street in her house as well. Hopefully, we can get her to do a 7 Praed Street at some point too. And she again really got interested in the Solar Pons, came to the Solar Pons dinner in New York this year. And PJ, for all your resourcefulness, you certainly deserve the title of a capable young woman. So congratulations, PJ, on your investiture into the PSI. And now is the part of the evening where we give our investees, our new investees, a chance if they want to just say thank you or to say a few words. They are welcome to do so. So, Larry, did you want to say anything? You have to unmute, though, sir.
I'm getting there.
There
Okay.
you go.
There I go. Okay. Well, I've nothing to say other than that I really do enjoy discussing the Solar Pond stories with the group on the Facebook page, and it's always quite interesting and quite insightful. And thank you for having me be a member.
You're welcome, Larry. Thank you for being here. Jay, how about you?
Well, I'm honored, and I thank you. And it's a good group, and I'm happy to be asked to be a member. I don't know if Derrick mentioned earlier, I live in Sarasota, Florida now, after many years in Washington, D.C. And Ben Stahl, whose work graced the covers of the Pinnacle paperbacks, lived in Sarasota as well, lived and died in Sarasota, as a matter of fact. And he was a terrific illustrator. But of course, the covers of the Pons Adventures, the paperbacks, are very striking. And in fact, Norman Rockwell thought that Stahl was the best, the finest illustrator in the country. So praise from that quarter is quite impressive.
So now, Jay, you have to start a Florida Solar Ponds group.
Yes.
We got to start some Scion societies now.
Right. In fact, I had talked with, communicated with Peter Blau about trying to get something going with the Sherlockians as well, and somewhere in the Tampa Bay area, because that group has been quiet for a while.
Perfect. Oh, no, that would be great. Yeah, the more the merrier, as we like to say. Hillary, did you want to say anything?
Sure. I am very new to Solar Ponds, and Derrick has been kind enough to give me my initial books, and I'm finding him wonderful. So consider me the most novice of all of you. And sitting here during the meeting, I realize there is a huge forest ahead of me to start walking through. But thank you so much for welcoming me, and I look forward to it. And that was a lovely name that you've given me in memory of my husband. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Okay. And Ralph obviously could not be here, but I know he was thrilled when I told him. And he said it meant a lot to him to be invested. George.
Yes. Well, again, it's a great honor. I worked for 46 years as a public librarian. Well, started off as an academic librarian, but most of my career was in the public library field, and read the first time around. I read Solar Pond so many years ago, but after the dinner in January, I thought I'm going to, start rereading. So I just finished the Chronicles and Derleth's last book, and enjoyed that very much. And I do love the interplay of characters. Some of that came to me from Philip Jose Farmer, the science fiction writer who created the
Yes.
Wold Newton universe. And in fact, Phil's first published piece related to the broader world of Sherlock Holmes was in the original series of the Pontine dossier. So there's a connection there as well. And he was a good friend of mine when he was alive, when I lived in Peoria and Illinois. And so all this is a roundabout way of saying I'm just delighted to be inducted into the Praed Street Irregulars. I love the name, and I will do my best to support the group and honor you back.
Oh, thank you. And we'll probably have to get you involved with that manuscript series since you're a librarian. So you probably could have great insights into it. So
Fair enough.
yes, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And lastly, PJ, who I think is in Baker Street right now, from looking at the background. Yeah.
I am in Baker Street at the moment. So gosh, I'm pleased as punch to be part of the group. I really am. It was so nice of you to invite me. I'm just happy as can be. Hillary, you and I will learn Solar Pons together because I am also very new to this. I put it off for a good long while out of a stubborn and irrational aversion to the name. I thought Solar Pons was a dumb name. And I told that to Derrick, and he said, please just look beyond that and try the books. And I was so pleasantly surprised. And it was a real treat to find a new detective that I could follow along. So I have to thank you for that. I don't know when a Praed Street room will happen because Baker Street, I expect to take a good more 50 or 60 years to wrap up. And then I have, Nero Wolfe and Poirot also on my list. So, it'll come perhaps. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Lovely.
And we had to have you, and you were like, oh, well, the Wolfpack invited me. I'm like, well, wait a minute here. Oh, well, thank you all for being here this afternoon. I think the time was slightly earlier than we did it last year, but I'm glad that everyone could make it. And we congratulate the class of 2025 and thank all of our esteemed PSI members and guests for joining us today, especially George Vanderberg, our Lord Warden. And we look forward to seeing everybody again in February of 2026, which will be our next meeting for investitures. But we hope to do at least something before then this year. And I'll have information about the Facebook event when it comes around. And obviously, we'll be working on publications and other things. And you're all welcome to start your own Solar Pons events as well. We'd love to hear if you do. So thank you again. And any other last things before we wrap up?
Nope. Thank you so much, Derrick.
Thank you, Hillary. All right. Thanks, George. And everybody have a wonderful, wherever you are in the world, afternoon, evening, or morning. Okay.
Okay.
We got the world here.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Derrick.
Thank you
Thank
and
you.
goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.